Rome, 1922. No tanks, no civil war, just 30,000 Blackshirts and one bold gamble. In 48 hours, Benito Mussolini flipped a fragile democracy into a fascist state legally. How does a socialist journalist reinvent himself as Il Duce and dismantle a nation from the inside? This is the power grab that rewrote Italy. Before he was Il Duce, he was a firebrand with ink-stained fingers. Benito Mussolini didn't begin as a nationalist strongman. He was raised in a household steeped in socialism. His father, a blacksmith who worshiped revolution, his mother a school teacher who believed in discipline. By his 20s, Mussolini wasn't just in the movement, he was leading its voice. As editor of Avanti, the newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party, he attacked capitalism, monarchy, and war with volcanic intensity. He preached class struggle, international solidarity, workers of the world unite. Then came 1914. World War I detonated the European order and Mussolini's ideology with it. While the Socialist Party demanded neutrality, he saw opportunity. War, he argued, wasn't a capitalist crime. It was a furnace, a violent reset button, a chance to forge a new Italy out of blood and steel. The backlash was immediate. He was expelled from the party he once embodied, branded a traitor, cast out. But exile didn't weaken him, it liberated him. Freed from Marxist orthodoxy, Mussolini began reshaping his worldview. Class struggle, too narrow. Economic determinism, too passive. The real engine of revolution, he concluded, wasn't the worker. It was the nation. Not solidarity, but unity under force. Not debate, but discipline. In the chaos of war, Mussolini found his revelation. If you could command nationalism and militarism, you could command history itself. And soon he would test that theory on Italy. Mussolini had found his new religion, the nation. Now he needed believers. In 1919, with Italy bruised, bitter, and feeling cheated by the peace after World War I, Benito Mussolini launched a movement that would weaponize that resentment, the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. It wasn't polished, it wasn't popular. In its first election, it was crushed. But Mussolini understood something his rivals didn't. Politics wasn't just about votes. It was about force, spectacle, and fear. Italy was spiraling. Strikes paralyzed factories. Peasants seized land. Socialist banners flooded the streets. To industrialists and landowners, it looked like revolution. To veterans returning from the trenches, it felt like betrayal. They had fought for glory. Instead, they found unemployment and chaos. Mussolini offered them purpose. Enter the Blackshirts paramilitary squads known as the Squadristi. They wore black uniforms like a badge of war. They traveled in trucks. They carried clubs, pistols, and castor oil. Their mission was simple: smash socialist offices, terrorize union leaders, break strikes by brute force. Violence wasn't a side effect. It was strategy. And it worked. Local authorities often looked the other way. Business elites quietly funded them. Many Italians, exhausted by disorder, began to see these street fighters as restorers of stability. Mussolini positioned himself as the only man who could stop a communist takeover, while his followers were the ones escalating the chaos. By 1921, the movement shed its rough-hewn edges and became a formal political machine, the National Fascist Party. What began as a fringe militia was now a national force. Mussolini had fused nationalism with organized violence, wrapped it in the language of renewal, and sold it as salvation. The streets were no longer just battlegrounds, they were campaign stages. And as Italy drifted deeper into crisis, the man once expelled as a radical outsider was positioning himself as the country's last best hope. The stage was set for his boldest gamble yet. By 1922, Italy wasn't just unstable, it was exhausted. Strikes choked the economy. Inflation devoured savings. Governments rose and fell in rapid succession, too weak to act, too divided to last. To many Italians, democracy looked less like freedom and more like paralysis. And in that vacuum, Benito Mussolini saw his opening. He didn't need a majority, he needed momentum. All across the countryside, Blackshirt squads tightened their grip, intimidating officials, crushing unions, seizing town halls. Fascist power was growing from the bottom up. But Mussolini wanted something bigger, a spectacle, a moment that would make resistance feel pointless. October 1922. He announced what sounded like an insurrection, a mass mobilization toward the capital. History would call it the March on Rome. Around 30,000 fascists gathered on the outskirts of Rome. They were poorly armed, disorganized, and not nearly strong enough to defeat the Italian army in open combat. If the state chose to crush them, it could have. And at first, it seemed it would. The government drafted an emergency decree for martial law. Troops were ready. The railways could be sealed. The march could be stopped before it began. Then everything hinged on one man, Victor Emmanuel III. Faced with the choice between confrontation and compromise, the king hesitated. He feared civil war. He feared the army might fracture. He feared that crushing Mussolini would ignite the very revolution the fascists claimed to prevent. So he refused to sign the decree. Instead, he invited Mussolini to form a government. Think about that. While Blackshirts camped in the rain outside Rome, Mussolini himself was miles away, waiting, calculating. When the call came, he traveled to the capital, not as a rebel storming the gates, but as a statesman summoned by the crown. No palace burned. No artillery roared. No final stand in the streets. The transfer of power was almost anticlimactic, but it was revolutionary. On October 30th, 1922, at just 39 years old, Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy, legally appointed, constitutionally recognized. The man who had built his movement on street violence had just seized the state without firing a decisive shot in Rome. The March on Rome wasn't a military conquest. It was psychological warfare. Mussolini proved that you don't always have to overthrow democracy. Sometimes you just have to convince it to surrender. And once inside the system, he would begin dismantling it piece by piece. Mussolini had walked into power through the front door. Now he would lock it behind him. When Benito Mussolini became prime minister, in 1922, Italy was still technically a democracy. Parliament still met. Opposition parties still spoke. Newspapers still criticized him. But technically was about to become meaningless. First came the law. In 1923, his government pushed through the Acerbo Law, a deceptively simple piece of legislation. Any party that won just 25% of the vote would automatically receive 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. It was legal, it was procedural, and it was engineered for one purpose: permanent fascist dominance. In the 1924 elections, intimidation did the rest. Blackshirts hovered near polling stations. Opposition candidates were threatened. Ballot boxes were managed. The fascists claimed victory, and thanks to the new law, an overwhelming majority. Then came the mistake that almost destroyed everything. A socialist deputy, Giacomo Matteotti, stood before Parliament and openly denounced the fraud and violence. Days later, he was kidnapped and murdered by fascist thugs. Italy exploded in outrage. The opposition walked out of Parliament in protest. Newspapers demanded accountability. Even members of Mussolini's inner circle panicked. For a moment, it looked like his regime might collapse under the weight of its own brutality. And Mussolini hesitated. He could have sacrificed subordinates, blamed rogue extremists, stepped back. Instead, on January 3, 1925, he made a decision that changed Italy forever. He stood before Parliament and delivered a chilling declaration. He would assume full political morale and historical responsibility for what had happened. It sounded like confession. It was a threat. In that speech, Mussolini dared his enemies to remove him. He framed the violence not as chaos, but as necessity, strength, destiny. And when no decisive action came against him, he understood something critical. There would be no serious resistance. What followed was swift and systematic. Opposition parties were outlawed. Independent newspapers were shut down. Local governments were purged. Political dissent became a crime. By the end of 1925, Italy was no longer a flawed democracy struggling to survive. It was a one-party state. Mussolini hadn't smashed the system in one explosive coup. He had hollowed it out from within, using law's intimidation and calculated audacity. Democracy didn't fall in a single night. It was dismantled in plain sight. And now, with no rivals left standing, Il Duce could begin building something far more ambitious, a totalitarian state. By 1925, the opposition was broken. Now Benito Mussolini moved from destroying democracy to replacing it. This wasn't about holding power anymore. It was about redesigning Italy from the ground up. First, he eliminated competition entirely. Political parties were outlawed. Socialist and liberal leaders were arrested, exiled, or silenced. Independent labor unions vanished, absorbed into a new corporative system where workers and employers were supposedly united under state supervision. In reality, strikes became illegal. Wages were controlled. The state stood above all. Parliament still existed, but it no longer debated. It obeyed. Then came surveillance. In 1927, Mussolini created a secret police force known as the Ovra. Its mission wasn't just to arrest enemies. It was to make people feel watched. Letters were opened. Conversations were reported. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Critics disappeared into internal exile on remote islands. Fear didn't need to be constant. It just needed to be possible. But repression alone wasn't enough. Mussolini understood that true control required admiration. And so, he built the myth. Posters flooded cities. Newspapers praised his tireless work ethic. Photographs showed him bare-chested harvesting, wheat piloting airplanes, skiing, fencing, always strong, always decisive. He wasn't just prime minister. He was Il Duce, the leader, a modern Caesar, the embodiment of national will. Children memorized his speeches. Workers hung his portrait in factories. His image stared down from public buildings across the country. The message was relentless. Mussolini is Italy. Italy is Mussolini. Through propaganda ritual and spectacle, fascism became more than a political system. It became atmosphere, a rhythm, a daily presence in schools, workplaces, and public squares. Elections no longer mattered. Debate no longer mattered. Individual identity shrank beneath the weight of the state. Italy had not simply lost its democracy. It had been transformed into something new, an experiment in total control where loyalty was mandatory, dissent was treason, and one man stood at the center of it all. The machinery was now in place. All that remained was to shape the minds of the next generation and prepare the nation for something even bigger. A regime can silence its enemies, but to survive, it has to shape the future. By the late 1920s, Benito Mussolini understood that fear alone wasn't enough. If fascism was going to last, it had to live in classrooms, cinemas, churches, and inside the minds of children. So he went after the young. Boys were enrolled in the fascist youth movement known as the Balilla. They wore uniforms. They marched in formation. They learned that obedience was honor and sacrifice was glory. Girls were trained for a different battlefield. The home taught that their duty was motherhood and loyalty to the state. Education stopped being neutral. Textbooks were rewritten. Teachers were required to swear allegiance to the regime. History itself was edited. Rome's imperial past was glorified. Liberal democracy was mocked as weak. Mussolini was presented not as a politician, but as destiny. Then came the media. Newspapers were no longer platforms for debate. They were loudspeakers for the regime. Editors received daily instructions on what could and could not be printed. Radio broadcasts carried the voice of Il Duce into living rooms across the country. In movie theaters, audiences were required to watch state-produced newsreels before the feature film carefully crafted images of prosperity, discipline, and unity. Propaganda wasn't occasional. It was constant. But Mussolini knew there was one institution he couldn't crush outright: the Catholic Church. For decades, the Church and the Italian state had been locked in tension. That conflict ended in 1929 with the Lateran Treaty. The agreement recognized Vatican City as an independent state and granted Catholicism special status within Italy. In return, the Church recognized Mussolini's regime. It was a masterstroke. By reconciling with the Vatican, Mussolini gained moral legitimacy in a deeply Catholic nation. The regime now had both the blessing of tradition and the machinery of modern propaganda. Children marched, newspapers echoed, priests no longer opposed. Fascism had moved beyond politics. It had become culture. And with the population disciplined, indoctrinated, and unified under one voice, Mussolini began looking outward toward conquest empire and a stage far larger than Italy itself. By the early 1930s, fascism controlled Italy's streets, schools, and soul. But for Benito Mussolini, control at home wasn't enough. He wanted glory. He spoke of spazio vitale, living space. Italy, he claimed, deserved an empire. The Mediterranean should be Mare Nostrum, our sea, just as it had been under Rome. The message was intoxicating. Fascism wouldn't just restore order, it would restore greatness. In 1935, Mussolini made his move. Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent nations in Africa. It was presented as a civilizing mission, a revival of Roman destiny. In reality, it was a brutal colonial war fought with overwhelming force. When Addis Ababa fell in 1936, Mussolini declared the birth of a new Italian empire. For a moment it worked. Crowds cheered. Propaganda celebrated victory. Italy felt powerful again. But the invasion came at a cost. The League of Nations imposed sanctions. Western democracies condemned the aggression. Italy was increasingly isolated. And isolation pushed Mussolini toward a new partner. In Adolf Hitler, he saw both opportunity and risk. At first, Mussolini viewed the German leader as a junior imitator. But as Nazi Germany rearmed and expanded, the balance shifted. Shared ideology, authoritarianism, nationalism, militarism drew them closer. The result was the Rome-Berlin axis. Later, the Pact of Steel. Italy and Germany now stood publicly aligned. To cement that bond, Mussolini went further. In 1938, his regime introduced racial laws targeting Jews, stripping them of citizenship, banning them from schools and professions, and excluding them from public life. It marked a sharp turn. Italian fascism had not begun with racial obsession, but now under the gravitational pull of Berlin, it adopted the language of exclusion and persecution. Italy was no longer just a dictatorship. It was part of a revolutionary alliance reshaping Europe. When war erupted in 1939, Mussolini hesitated. Italy wasn't ready. But by 1940, convinced that Germany would win quickly, he entered the conflict seeking spoils without preparation. It was a gamble driven by ego and illusion. And this time, the spectacle would not end in applause. The empire he had promised would soon unravel, and the machine he built so carefully at home would begin to turn against him. Mussolini had gambled on war. He lost. By 1943, the myth of invincibility was shattered. Italian campaigns in Greece and North Africa had stalled or collapsed. Cities were bombed. Supplies ran thin. The new Roman Empire looked less like destiny and more like disaster. Then came the breaking point. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The invasion exposed the truth. Italy was vulnerable, exhausted, and outmatched. Inside Rome, panic spread not among civilians, but within the fascist elite itself. For the first time, Mussolini's own inner circle turned on him. The fascist Grand Council convened and voted to remove him from power. It was an act almost unthinkable just years earlier. When Benito Mussolini went to meet the king expecting support, he was instead dismissed and arrested. Just like that, Il Duce was no longer in control. But the story didn't end there. In a daring German commando raid, ordered by Hitler, Mussolini was rescued from captivity in September 1943. He was flown north and installed as the head of a new regime, the Italian Social Republic, based in the town of Salo. It was fascism's ghost. The so-called Salo Republic existed under Nazi protection. Its authority, then its power, dependent on German troops. Civil war now tore through northern Italy as partisans Loyalists and occupying forces clashed. The country Mussolini claimed to have unified was fractured beyond repair. And the end was closing in. By April 1945, Allied armies were advancing. German lines were collapsing. Mussolini knew it was over. Disguised and desperate, he attempted to flee towards Switzerland with his mistress and a small convoy. He never made it. Captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como, Mussolini was executed on April 28, 1945. The next day, his body was transported to Milan and hung upside down in Piazzale Loreto, the same city square where fascists had once displayed their enemies. The image was shocking, final, inevitable. The man who built a state on spectacle met his end in one last brutal display. From socialist journalist to dictator, from balcony speeches to a roadside execution, Mussolini's rise had been calculated, strategic, relentless. His fall was swift and merciless. And with his death, the fascist era in Italy came crashing down, leaving behind a warning etched in history: power seized through fear can endure for years, but it never escapes the reckoning. Mussolini was gone, but fascism didn't vanish with a single gunshot. When Benito Mussolini was executed in April 1945, Italy wasn't just ending a regime, it was confronting 20 years of complicity, fear, propaganda, and silence. Cities lay in ruins. The economy was shattered. Families were divided by civil war. And the question hung heavy in the air: how did we let this happen? The monarchy that had empowered him, led by Victor Emmanuel III, collapsed under public anger. In 1946, Italians voted to abolish the crown altogether, choosing a republic over a return to the old order. A new constitution followed in 1948, deliberately engineered to prevent another strongman from hijacking the system. Checks and balances were strengthened. Civil liberties were enshrined. Fascism was outlawed. Italy rebuilt. But memory is complicated. For decades, some Italians preferred to remember Mussolini as a flawed modernizer rather than a dictator. The trains ran on time, they said. Order was restored. National pride revived. It was a selective memory, one that blurred repression, censorship, racial laws, and war into the background. History, however, is less forgiving. Mussolini's rise revealed something uncomfortable. Democracy doesn't always fall to tanks in the streets. It can erode through legal loopholes, political deals, public fear, and calculated intimidation. He didn't storm Rome in a blaze of gunfire. He pressured, postured, and positioned himself until the system handed him the keys. And once inside, he rewrote the rules. The lesson isn't just about Italy in the 1920s. It's about how fragile institutions become during crisis. High unemployment, political polarization, fear of revolution. A leader promising strength over debate, unity over dissent. Mussolini understood spectacle. He understood momentum. He understood that if people feel unsafe long enough, they may trade liberty for certainty. His regime ended in humiliation and violence, but for over 2 decades, it seemed unstoppable. That's the paradox. A man dismissed as a radical journalist became a dictator through strategy, timing, and audacity. A democracy hollowed itself out before most citizens realized it was happening. And in the end, the balcony speeches, the parades, the propaganda, they all led back to a single image in a Milan square. Power can be seized dramatically, but it rarely ends the way its architect imagines. History remembered Il Duce not as a savior of Italy, but as a warning. So what did Mussolini actually build? Not just a regime, a blueprint. Looking back at the rise of Benito Mussolini, the pattern is chillingly methodical. Step 1. Exploit crisis. Italy after World War I was humiliated, unstable, and afraid. Economic collapse. Political paralysis. The threat, real or exaggerated, of socialist revolution. Mussolini didn't create the chaos. He harvested it. Step 2. Normalize violence. The Blackshirts didn't hide in shadows, they marched openly. They attacked opponents in broad daylight. And when authorities failed to punish them, violence stopped being shocking. It became political currency. Step 3. Enter legally. The March on Rome wasn't a battlefield victory, it was a psychological one. Once appointed Prime Minister Mussolini didn't abolish democracy overnight. He operated inside it, passed laws, built coalitions, used procedure as a weapon. Step 4. Change the rules. The Acerbo Law guaranteed dominance. Elections became formalities. Parliament became decoration. By the time opponents understood the scale of the shift, the system had already been redesigned. Step 5. Control the narrative. Press censorship. State newsreels, youth indoctrination. The Lateran Treaty securing religious legitimacy. Fascism became culture, not just policy. Mussolini wasn't just governing Italy, he was scripting reality. Step 6. Expand outward. Foreign conquest fed domestic pride. The invasion of Ethiopia, the Rome-Berlin axis, racial laws aligning Italy with Nazi Germany. War wasn't just strategy, it was spectacle meant to sustain the myth of greatness. And finally, overreach. Unprepared for global conflict, Italy collapsed under the weight of its own propaganda. The strongman who promised destiny delivered disaster. That's the full arc. A socialist firebrand turned nationalist revolutionary. A paramilitary organizer turned prime minister. A constitutional leader turned dictator. A self-proclaimed Caesar ending as a fugitive. Mussolini's story isn't random chaos. It's structured escalation. Each move built on the last. Each gamble raised the stakes. And that's why it endures. Because it shows how power can be seized, not in one explosive moment, but in increments. Legal tweaks, cultural shifts, strategic intimidation, public fatigue. Democracy rarely dies in a single dramatic scene. It erodes, it bends, it rationalizes, until one day it no longer recognizes itself. Mussolini didn't invent authoritarianism, but he perfected a modern method of capturing a state from within. And history made sure the final image would outlast the speeches the dictator who once commanded millions, reduced to a symbol of how fragile power truly is.